Vivian Montgomery stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Meridian Aerospace Tower, watching the heavy morning fog swallow the tarmac at Blackwood Airfield. It was the most critical morning of her professional life, and the foundation beneath her feet was fracturing. Her primary executive transport had just suffered a total unexplained systems blackout in the secure hangar. Her longtime driver had been rushed into emergency surgery 2 hours prior. The $5 billion acquisition of Triton Skyways depended entirely on her arriving at the high-stakes investor summit at the Silverton Heritage Estate across the mountain ridge within the 90 minutes. Audrey Sterling, her breathless operations manager, burst into the office with an expression of pure panic. The only contractor with an active security clearance who could respond immediately was a man named Garrett Cross. When Garrett walked into the executive suite, he did not look like the kind of elite asset Vivian usually employed. He wore a faded, meticulously ironed charcoal button-down shirt and dark trousers, his leather shoes polished but showing signs of long wear. He possessed a striking, quiet stillness, an unbothered masculinity that felt completely disconnected from the corporate firestorm raging around him. Standing just behind him was his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, who held his hand tightly while gripping a worn sketchbook against her chest. Vivian didn't have time for a family man. Nor did she have patience for someone who brought a child to a multi-billion-dollar emergency. She adjusted her tailored blazer, her eyes sweeping over Garrett with cold, clinical efficiency. "You are late, Mr. Cross," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the room like shattered ice. "And this is not a daycare center. I am paying for an elite logistical asset, not a family outing." Garrett did not flinch. His gaze remained steady, calm, and entirely grounded. "The dispatch call came exactly 11 minutes ago, ma'am," he replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no defensiveness. "Lily will remain in the vehicle's passenger cabin. She will not be a distraction. We have 84 minutes to reach the estate. If we leave now, I will get you there with 3 minutes to spare." Before Vivian could reply, the heavy double doors of the suite swung open. Harrison Thorne, a ruthless senior board member who had been orchestrating a quiet coup to oust Vivian from the company her family built, stepped into the room. He wore a bespoke 3-piece suit and carried himself with the smug satisfaction of a man who knew his trap was closing. "Going somewhere in a hurry, Vivian?" Harrison asked, his voice dripping with condescension as he glanced at his platinum watch. "I heard about the transport failure downstairs. Terrible timing. Though, looking at your new choice of staff, it seems the Montgomery Standard has fallen even faster than our stock price." Harrison turned his arrogant gaze toward Garrett, looking down his nose at the plain shirt and the little girl holding his hand. He let out a dry, mocking chuckle. "Who is this? Did you hire a mechanic from the local body shop to handle the steering wheel? Young man, do you even know how to find the interstate, or are you going to ask the little girl for directions?" Audrey shifted uncomfortably, and a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The junior executives in the hallway stopped to watch the public humiliation unfold. Harrison was testing Vivian's authority, using Garrett as a prop to demonstrate her complete loss of control over the company. Garrett did not raise his voice. He didn't tighten his fists. Instead, he stepped slightly forward, his frame naturally shielding Lily from Harrison's hostile presence. He looked directly into the older billionaire's eyes with a chilling, unblinking authority that made Harrison's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. "The route to Silverton Heritage Estate is currently congested due to a jackknife semi-truck on the eastbound interstate corridor," Garrett said, his tone entirely level, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "If your driver takes that path, Mr. Thorne, you will be trapped in gridlock for 45 minutes. I suggest you take the old logging pass if you intend to make the opening remarks. Come along, Miss Montgomery. We are losing our window." Vivian stared at him, stunned by the sheer audacity of his intervention. Harrison's face flushed deep crimson, his arrogance momentarily wounded by a mere contract driver. "Watch your mouth, boy," Harrison hissed, stepping closer. "You have no idea who you are talking to." Garrett didn't answer. He simply looked down at Lily, his expression softening instantly into a warm, protective smile. "Ready, sweetie?" he asked softly. Lily nodded, looking up at her father with absolute unwavering trust. "Ready, Daddy?" Turning his back completely on the furious board member, Garrett gestured for Vivian to follow him toward the private executive elevator. As the doors slid shut, separating them from Harrison's glare, Vivian looked at the quiet, single father standing beside her. She felt an unsettling, electric charge in the air. This man was not a simple driver. He didn't speak like one. He didn't react like one, and the way he had looked at Harrison suggested he had faced down men far more dangerous than a corporate raider. As they descended into the darkened executive garage, Vivian noticed Garrett's eyes scanning the shadows, his hand resting lightly on the strap of his leather bag in a tactical posture that looked entirely second nature. The mystery had just begun, and the clock was ticking. The armored Valiant Sentinel cut through the thickening gray soup of the lower mountain valley with an eerie, frictionless glide. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Vivian Montgomery sat in the plush leather of the rear seat, her tablet illuminating her face in a cold blue hue as she frantically scanned the revised financial projections for Triton Skyways. Every second mattered. If Harrison Thorne beat her to the Silverton Heritage Estate, he would present a corrupted asset liquidation plan to the primary institutional investors, effectively ending her tenure as chief executive. In the front passenger seat, 7-year-old Lily Cross remained perfectly silent, her small fingers holding a charcoal pencil as she sketched a remarkably detailed rendering of a twin-propeller aircraft flying through storm clouds. Garrett Cross kept both hands on the wheel, his posture perfectly erect, yet completely relaxed. Vivian watched him through the rearview mirror. His eyes did not wander. They moved in a precise, rhythmic scanning pattern: left mirror, center, right mirror, the road ahead, repeating the sequence exactly every 4 seconds. It wasn't the driving style of a civilian chauffeur. It was the defensive, high-threat driving style of someone trained to pilot heavy armor through hostile territory. "Mr. Cross," Vivian said, her voice sharp as she checked her watch. "You just bypassed the turnoff for the scenic highway." The navigation system explicitly states the Oak Haven Ridge Pass is closed to unauthorized civilian traffic due to the fog density. "Why are we heading toward a restricted zone?" "The highway is already choked with the gridlock I predicted, ma'am," Garrett replied, his voice a steady, grounding frequency in the quiet car. "The commercial transport sector just reported a fuel spill near the valley mouth. If we stay on the main artery, you will miss your board presentation entirely." "The pass is blocked by a military-grade security gate managed by Vanguard Crest Security," Vivian countered, her frustration mounting. "They do not let corporate sedans through. Turn the vehicle around." "I cannot afford to be detained by armed guards today." "Daddy knows the secret way," Lily piped up softly from the front seat, not looking up from her drawing. "He always gets people home safely." "Lily," Garrett said gently, his tone shifting from the cool professional to an incredibly warm, protective father. "Let's keep our focus on the drawing, sweetheart. What color are you going to make the wings?" "Silver, Daddy." "Like the ones in your old wooden box," she whispered. Garrett offered her a fleeting, incredibly tender smile that completely transformed his rugged features. Watching the interaction, Vivian felt a sudden, unfamiliar ache in her chest. Her own father, the legendary founder of Meridian Aerospace, had never looked at her that way. He had viewed her as an investment, a successor to be molded through strict discipline and calculated isolation. He had never smiled at her drawings. He had never spoken to her with that kind of unyielding, unconditional safety. The contrast between Garrett's quiet, masculine warmth and the cold world Vivian inhabited was disorienting. She shook the thought away, hardening her expression. Money bought security, emotional sentimentality was a liability. "We are approaching the perimeter," Vivian warned, leaning forward as the massive, iron-reinforced security gates of the Oak Haven Pass loomed through the fog. 2 guards dressed in tactical gear, carrying automatic rifles, stepped out of the guardhouse. "This is absurd. We are going to be arrested." Garrett did not slow down until he reached the precise stopping line painted on the asphalt. He rolled down his window as a stern-faced guard approached, his hand resting visibly on his sidearm. "This is a restricted tactical corridor," the guard announced roughly, tapping the door. "State your authorization or turn back immediately." Garrett didn't argue. He didn't offer a corporate ID or Vivian's high-level executive credentials. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, tarnished silver coin with a deeply engraved emblem, a striking celestial hawk gripping a broken arrow. He placed it flat on his palm, holding it out into the damp morning air. The guard looked down at the coin. Instantly, the man's entire demeanor shattered. His chest snapped to attention, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He took a step back, raised his right hand to his brow, and delivered a crisp, flawlessly executed military salute to the humble driver. "Clear to pass, sir." The guard barked, his voice trembling slightly with profound respect. "Apologies for the delay. The grid is yours." The massive steel gates began to grind open. Vivian sat frozen in the back seat, her breath catching in her throat as Garrett calmly pocketed the coin, rolled up the window, and accelerated into the mountain fog without a single word. She stared at the back of his head, her mind spinning in complete chaos. Who on earth was the man sitting at her steering wheel? What was that? Vivian's voice was barely a whisper, her hands gripping the edge of the leather seat as the valiant sentinel climbed higher into the misty peaks. Who are those guards, and why did they salute you like you own the mountain? Garrett did not look back. His eyes remained locked on the narrow, winding asphalt of the Ridge Pass. The men who secure these high-altitude corridors are trained to recognize old operating protocols, Miss Montgomery. It's a closed network, nothing more. You don't just carry a coin that commands federal-level security forces to open a restricted military pass, Vivian pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. That was a high-threat salute. I know the difference. My father dealt with defense contractors for 30 years. Who are you, Garrett? The car rounded a sharp, precipitous bend, and the grand limestone arches of the Silverton Heritage Estate materialized through the shifting curtains of fog. Garrett slowed the vehicle, pulling smoothly into the stone-paved VIP courtyard. I am your driver for the day, ma'am, Garrett said softly, his voice returning to that perfectly composed, professional baseline. And we have exactly 3 minutes before the opening proxy remarks begin. Before Vivian could demand a real answer, the heavy passenger door was pulled open from the outside by a uniformed valet. The courtyard was a buzzing hive of high society opulence. Sleek, multi-million-dollar hypercars lined the drive, and a swarm of financial journalists and prominent institutional investors huddled near the entrance, their cameras clicking furiously. Standing at the top of the grand marble steps holding a crystal glass of sparkling water was Harrison Thorne. He was flanked by Preston Vance, the kingmaker of the Pacific Northwest investment block, a man whose single nod could authorize or crush a $5 billion acquisition. Harrison smiled like a wolf that had just cornered its prey. Ah, Vivian, Harrison's voice boomed across the pavilion, drawing the immediate attention of the surrounding crowd. We almost assumed you had surrendered before the negotiation even began. Tell me, did your luxury transport break down, or did you simply decide that arriving in a standard leased sedan would elicit sympathy from the board? Vivian stepped out of the vehicle, her spine instantly straightening into a rigid line of absolute executive authority. She ignored Harrison's barbs, her eyes locking onto Preston Vance. Mr. Vance, thank you for your patience. The mountain traffic was unprecedented, but Meridian Aerospace is fully prepared to present the audit. It's not your transit choice that concerns me, Vivian, Harrison interrupted, stepping down the stairs with a venomous smirk. He pointed a manicured finger toward the front passenger side of the vehicle, where Garrett was stepping out to open the door for Lily. It is your catastrophic lack of judgment. Look at this. You have turned an elite, closed-door, multi-billion-dollar summit into a playground. You bring a common driver and his baggage to the most sensitive negotiation of our fiscal year? This is the woman you want leading the Triton acquisition, Preston. She can't even manage her own morning logistics without turning it into a family field trip. A low murmur rippled through the gathered crowd of executives and journalists. Cameras began to pivot, lenses focusing tightly on Garrett as he gently lifted Lily out of the seat. Lily held her worn sketchbook tightly against her chest, her large eyes wide with sudden fear as she looked at the sea of cold, judgmental faces and the aggressive posture of the wealthy men on the steps. Suddenly, a group of overzealous financial reporters broke past the loose security perimeter, rushing toward Vivian with microphones extended. The sudden, chaotic movement and the explosive, blinding flash of a dozen professional camera strobes filled the courtyard. "Get back!" Vivian commanded, but her voice was drowned out by the shouting press. The bright, violent flashes and the aggressive noise triggered something terrifying for Lily. She let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her small hands began to tremble violently, and the precious sketchbook slipped from her fingers, its pages scattering across the damp stone floor. She covered her ears, hyperventilating as she dropped to her knees, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the crowd. Vivian froze. In the ruthless arena of hostile corporate takeovers, she was an absolute predator, capable of dismantling an opponent with a single sentence. But looking down at the weeping, terrified 7-year-old girl at her feet, she felt an overwhelming wave of absolute, paralyzing helplessness. Her chest tightened. She didn't know how to comfort a child. She had never been allowed to cry as a child herself. She reached a hand out, her fingers trembling, completely losing her composure in front of the cameras. But before the reporters could crowd any closer, a massive, unyielding shadow fell over Lily. Garrett moved with an explosive, fluid speed that didn't look human. In a single heartbeat, he stepped directly into the line of fire, his broad, muscular frame completely shielding Lily from the aggressive media glare. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned his head and leveled a cold, predatory stare at the closest photographer. The sheer, lethal intensity in Garrett's eyes caused the seasoned reporter to instantly step back, dropping his camera in primitive fear. Garrett dropped to one knee on the hard stone, entirely ignoring the billionaires, the press, and the corporate theater around him. He gathered Lily into his powerful arms, pulling her tightly against his chest. "Look at me, lily pad," Garrett whispered, his voice a deep, unshakable anchor of absolute safety that instantly cut through the chaotic noise. "Just my voice, sweetie. You're entirely safe. Count the rhythm with me. 1, 2, 3. Lily buried her face deep into the collar of his pressed shirt, her small frame heaving as she clung to his neck. Within 3 seconds, guided entirely by the calm, immovable strength of her father, her breathing began to slow. The trembling stopped. She was completely safe in his arms, entirely insulated from the billionaire's playground. Vivian watched the transformation with a profound, aching breath. She saw the absolute contrast between her world of infinite wealth and this man's world of quiet, emotional security. Harrison Thorne possessed billions, yet he was small, volatile, and cruel. Garrett Cross possessed nothing but a leased sedan and a pressed shirt, yet he stood like an emperor, radiating an effortless, protective masculinity that made the entire corporate elite look utterly insignificant. Preston Vance stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he stared intently at Garrett's face. The older billionaire's expression suddenly shifted from casual amusement to absolute, bloodless shock. He recognized the jawline. He recognized that specific, lethal calm under pressure. "Wait," Vance whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he took a step down the marble stairs. "It can't be. You were at the siege of the Altair Ridge. Your commander." Garrett stood up smoothly, cradling his daughter effortlessly with one arm while picking up her scattered sketchbook with the other. He looked directly at Preston Vance, a silent, chilling command in his eyes that caused the older billionaire to instantly choke back the rest of his sentence. The courtyard fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Harrison Thorne looked between his primary investor and the humble driver, his smug confidence suddenly fracturing from the inside out. Something massive was hiding beneath the surface of this morning, and the balance of power had just shifted. Preston Vance remained frozen on the marble stairs, his chest heaving as he stared down at the humble driver. The air in the courtyard had turned utterly radioactive. Harrison Thorne, sensing the sudden shift in his primary investor's demeanor, let out a forced, rattling laugh to break the suffocating spell. "Preston, please," Harrison scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as he stepped between Vance and Garrett. "The morning mountain fog must be playing tricks on your memory. This man is a glorified civilian chauffeur who couldn't clear a basic corporate credit check, let alone hold a military commission. He's nobody." Harrison turned his venomous gaze toward the estate's private security detail standing near the grand entrance. "Officers, remove this man and his child from the premises immediately. They are trespassing on restricted corporate property, and their presence is a direct violation of our summit security protocols. Drag them out if you must." 2 burly security guards clad in dark tactical uniforms stepped forward, their heavy boots crunching against the stone. Before they could take a third step, Vivian Montgomery moved. With a fierce, blazing intensity that shocked everyone in the courtyard, she threw herself directly in front of Lily, her tailored frame forming an unyielding barrier between the guards and the little girl. "Stand down," Vivian commanded, her voice ringing out like a cracked whip across the pavilion. There was a raw, protective desperation in her eyes that she had never shown in a boardroom in her entire life. "Mr. Cross is under my direct, personal employ. He is my lead logistical advisor for this summit. If you lay a single hand on him or his daughter, you are removing the chief executive officer of Meridian Aerospace from this property. I will pull every single share out of this acquisition before the sun hits the Meridian." Harrison's eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. "Then perhaps we should expedite the board's vote of no confidence right here on the steps, Vivian. Look at yourself. You are completely compromised, defending gutter trash and a crying child instead of focusing on a $5 billion transaction. You've lost your mind." Suddenly, a piercing, high-pitched emergency siren shattered the atmospheric tension of the estate. The sound didn't come from the security team. It came from the high-end tablets and smartphones of every single executive, board member, and journalist in the courtyard. Simultaneously, a series of urgent, crimson alert banners began flashing across their screens. Inside the main ballroom, the massive, triple-segmented LED array behind the primary podium automatically overrode the corporate presentation, displaying a live telemetry video feed wrapped in pulsing amber warning bars. The entire crowd pushed through the double doors, driven by immediate primitive panic. Vivian, Garrett, and Lily followed the rush into the grand hall. On the massive screens, a live, high-definition camera tracking feed showed the sleek, carbon fiber silhouette of the Calum. 9 Aerocruiser Triton Skyway's multi-million-dollar flagship prototype aircraft, which was currently conducting a live-streamed autonomous demonstration flight for the institutional investors over the northern mountain ridge. The aircraft was pitching violently against a turbulent sky, its left wing dipping dangerously as it entered a terrifying, uncontrolled aerodynamic spin. A frantic, echoing voice cut through the ballroom's surround sound audio system. It was Dr. Graham Kendrick, the chief aerospace engineer, broadcasting live from the remote control facility at the Helios hangar. "We have a catastrophic system desynchronization, Dr." Kendrick shouted, his voice cracking with absolute terror over the sound of blaring alarms in the background. "The atmospheric inversion layer has completely corrupted our primary satellite command link." The autonomous flight control system is stuck in a terminal data loop. The aircraft is stalling at 28,000 feet and descending at 4,000 feet per minute. Every manual override command we send from the ground station is being violently rejected by the onboard computer. The ballroom descended into instant, screaming chaos. Billionaires rose from their leather chairs, knocking over crystal glasses, watching their massive financial portfolios literally plunge toward the earth on live television. Harrison Thorne turned entirely translucent, his hands trembling as he stared at the rapidly dropping altitude indicators. "Fix it, Kendrick!" Harrison screamed at the video display, his composure completely disintegrating. "If that prototype crashes into the valley, the Triton valuation goes to zero. We will be bankrupted before the market opens. Find a way to override it. We can't break the encryption loop from the ground." "Doctor!" Kendrick despaired, burying his face in his hands on the screen. The remote interface is completely dead. In less than 90 seconds, the airframe will exceed its structural load limit and disintegrate in mid-air. While the wealthiest minds in the American aerospace sector froze, screamed, and pointed fingers, Garrett Cross remained the single immovable point of absolute calm in the room. He didn't panic. He walked quietly to the back row, gently lifted Lily into a plush, cushioned armchair, and gave her a soft, reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Stay right here, Lily Pad. Keep working on your drawing for Daddy, okay?" "Ready, Daddy," Lily whispered, her voice completely calm now because she knew that when her father looked that steady, the world could not hurt them. Garrett turned and walked purposefully down the center aisle of the ballroom. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped past the panicking junior executives, pushed through the ring of trembling board members, and stood directly in front of the primary tactical terminal linked to the live flight deck data. His eyes scanned the cascading lines of flashing amber error codes. His face was entirely devoid of fear. It was the cold, calculating expression of an elite master looking at a child's toy. "Get away from that terminal." Harrison Thorne roared, noticing his driver touching the multi-million-dollar tactical interface. "Security, drag this lunatic away from the controls before he destroys what's left of our data." "Shut your mouth, Harrison!" Preston Vance roared back, his voice booming with a terrifying authority that silenced the entire room. Vance stepped forward, his eyes glued to the back of Garrett's pressed shirt. "Let him look." Garrett ignored the noise behind him. His fingers began to move across the terminal interface with a staggering, rhythmic velocity that left the surrounding engineers breathless. He tapped into the direct audio link to the control hangar. "Doctor." "Kendrick, you are tracking the failure as a software corruption," Garrett said, his deep, resonant baritone cutting through the alarms like a foghorn. "It isn't. The high-altitude inversion layer froze the external sensing ports on the nose. Your onboard computer thinks the airframe is flying 300 knots faster than its actual speed. It's fighting a ghost parameter. On the massive screen, Doctor." Kendrick blinked in absolute shock, looking around his control room. Who is that? How do you have access to that operational data?" "You need to force an immediate atmospheric purge to clear the sensors," Garrett commanded, his voice rising with an absolute, undeniable dominance that took total control of the multi-billion-dollar crisis. "But you cannot do it through the corrupted satellite link. You have to send a raw, unencrypted radio frequency pulse directly to the secondary emergency analog receiver, frequency 348.2. That frequency was decommissioned 12 years ago." Kendrick protested frantically. "It's an old, high-altitude military emergency band. The corporate software shouldn't even recognize it." "It is still hardwired into the foundational safety relays of every engine Triton ever built," Garrett said, his eyes narrowing to razor-sharp points as the altitude indicator flashed a warning at 12,000 feet. The structural camera showed the Calum 9's carbon wings bending to the absolute breaking point under the violent pressure. "Send the pulse, Doctor, now, before the airframe tears itself apart." The entire ballroom held its collective breath, the silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like cannon fire. "Doctor," Kendrick's hand hovered over an ancient manual frequency dial on his console, his face drenched in sweat as he looked at the unknown driver through the screen. "Doctor." Graham Kendrick's hand trembled so violently he almost missed the ancient analog dial on his console. In the Silverton Heritage Estate ballroom, 100 billionaires and institutional investors watched the live telemetry screen, their breath completely trapped in their throats. The Calum 9 Aerocruiser was screaming through 7,000 feet, its structural integrity dropping to 12%. Kendrick slammed the emergency toggle, locking the transmission into frequency 348.2. A harsh, static-heavy tone cut through the ballroom's surround sound speakers, followed by a violent, agonizing screech of data sinking across the mountain miles. On the massive LED display, the cascading lines of amber error codes suddenly froze. For 2 agonizing seconds, the aircraft continued its terrifying descent, plunging through the mist toward the jagged rock formations below. Harrison Thorne covered his eyes, whispering a curse that signaled the absolute ruin of his financial empire. Vivian Montgomery stepped closer to Garrett, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, a solid robotic chime echoed from the terminal. "Analog manual emergency override accepted. Ground-to-air direct relay active." The live video feed showed the sleek carbon fiber nose of the prototype aircraft pitch upward with sudden, violent precision. The atmospheric purge valve engaged, venting a cloud of supercooled crystalline vapor from the nose cone. Instantly, the corrupted data loop shattered, and the flight parameters stabilized into a flawless, steady ascent. The Calum 9 soared smoothly back into the sky, clearing the highest peak of the ridge by less than 400 feet. The ballroom remained entirely silent for a single, stunned second before erupting into a deafening wave of gasps, frantic telephone calls, and explosive sighs of relief. On the projection screen, Dr. Kendrick dropped into his chair, staring out at the camera lens and directly at Garrett Cross with an expression of profound, unadulterated awe. "The emergency loop is broken," Kendrick breathed, his voice trembling through the sound system. "The internal telemetry is clear. Whoever just ordered that purge didn't just save Triton Skyways. They solved an atmospheric navigation flaw we've been trying to diagnose for 3 years. Who is that man?" That specific analog emergency band was classified under the Defense Architecture Protocols over a decade ago. It doesn't exist in civilian manuals. Garrett did not answer. He didn't even look toward the screen to acknowledge the billionaire engineers who were now staring at him like he was a savior. He calmly stepped away from the tactical terminal, his face as unreadable and steady as it had been when he first walked into Vivian's office. He walked straight to the back row of the ballroom, where Lily was sitting quietly in the oversized armchair. He knelt beside her, completely ignoring the sea of wealthy elites who were parting for him as if he were royalty. He looked down at her sketchbook, his eyes softening instantly. "Those are beautiful silver wings, lily pad," Garrett said softly, his deep voice radiating that absolute, grounding warmth. "You did an incredible job keeping your focus. I told you, Daddy," Lily whispered, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she leaned against his shoulder. "You always know how to fix the airplanes." Vivian Montgomery walked slowly down the aisle toward them, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with corporate transactions or financial metrics. She had spent her entire life surrounded by the most powerful, brilliant, and wealthy men in the country, but she had never witnessed a display of power like this. Garrett had just saved a $5 billion enterprise with a handful of keystrokes, yet his only priority was ensuring his daughter felt safe in a room full of strangers. Preston Vance pushed past a group of stunned board members, his expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor as he approached Garrett. The older billionaire's face was completely flushed, his usual aristocratic composure entirely shattered. "The Aegis Defense Initiative," Vance said, his voice carrying an intense, trembling weight that drew the attention of the remaining crowd. 12 years ago, the Pentagon commissioned an elite black-budget aviation task force to develop the foundational safety relays for the next generation of stealth transport. The chief military engineer and legendary test pilot who designed those analog overrides vanished from the public record after a tactical mission in the High Valley. They called him the Ghost of the Ridge. Vance stepped directly in front of Garrett, bowing his head slightly, in an unconscious gesture of immense respect. "Commander Cross, it really is you. You wrote the code that just saved that aircraft." Harrison Thorne stepped forward, his face twisted into an ugly, desperate mask of defiance. He couldn't let the narrative slip away. He couldn't let Vivian win. "This is absurd," Harrison shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I don't care if he guessed an old military radio frequency. It doesn't change the facts of this morning's gross negligence. Vivian Montgomery's primary transport was maliciously sabotaged before dawn. Her internal security is completely compromised. She cannot even secure her own garage, which proves she is entirely unfit to execute an acquisition of this magnitude. The board vote of no confidence stands." Garrett stood up slowly from his daughter's side. He turned his gaze toward Harrison Thorne, his quiet masculinity suddenly radiating a chilling, predatory focus that made the entire ballroom drop into an icy silence. The firmware injection that disabled Miss Montgomery's vehicle wasn't an outside cyber attack, Mr. Thorne, Garrett said, his level tone carrying the force of an absolute executioner's verdict. It was uploaded using a short-range, localized transceiver calibrated to the proprietary Meridian corporate frequency. A transceiver that requires physical proximity to the engine block and an administrative encryption key. Garrett took 2 slow, measured steps toward the arrogant board member, his physical presence completely dominating the space. A transceiver exactly like the prototype device currently transmitting an active digital signature from the inside left pocket of your bespoke jacket. Harrison Thorne looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The arrogant, untouchable smirk on his face evaporated in an instant, leaving his features completely hollowed out by a sudden, terrifying realization. The billionaires, investors, and elite executives around him instinctively stepped backward, creating a wide, empty circle around the senior board member as if he had suddenly become highly contagious. "This is a preposterous, unmitigated fabrication," Harrison stammered, his voice jumping an octave as he clutched his tailored jacket tightly against his chest. "You are taking the word of a baseline contract driver over a legacy shareholder? This man is an absolute nobody, trying to deflect from his own security. Incompetence." Garrett Cross did not move an inch. He stood in the center of the grand ballroom, his broad shoulders squared, radiating an immovable masculine authority that completely pinned Harrison to the spot. He didn't raise his hand or threaten force. Instead, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his own standard-issue smartphone, tapping the glass screen once. A clean, digital sonar pulse echoed from the device through the ballroom's sound system. Instantly, a steady, rhythmic pinging sound began to emanate directly from Harrison's left breast pocket, perfectly synchronized with a flashing green indicator on Garrett's screen. "The transceiver operates on a localized, high-frequency broadcast loop, Mr. Thorne," Garrett said, his deep baritone carrying an unyielding weight that anchored the entire room. "It logs every automated transmission timestamp, the exact millisecond miss. Montgomery's vehicle suffered its system's blackout in the secure underground garage. That unit in your pocket authorized the override command using your personal, high-level administrative encryption key. It is still searching for a secondary handshake with the network right now." Preston Vance looked at Harrison, his eyes turning to chips of frozen blue flint. The old kingmaker did not tolerate betrayal, especially when a man's petty greed threatened a multi-billion-dollar acquisition he had personally vetted. "Harrison," Vance said, his voice deadly quiet, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a razor blade. "Empty your pocket. Right now." "Preston, you cannot seriously believe this theater." "Empty the pocket, Harrison," Vance repeated, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or delay. "Or my personal estate security team will empty it for you, and I will personally ensure the federal authorities handle the corporate espionage investigation before the market opens." With trembling, bloodless fingers, Harrison slowly reached inside his bespoke jacket. He pulled out a small, sleek, black aluminum module, no larger than a standard key fob. It was pulsing with a faint, amber light, the precise proprietary light that matched the encryption sequence of Meridian Aerospace. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the ballroom. The financial journalists at the edge of the room began typing furiously on their devices, the entire narrative transforming from an aviation crisis into an unprecedented corporate execution on live television. Vivian Montgomery stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying clarity. The temporary sense of paralyzing helplessness she had felt minutes ago when Lily was crying had completely vanished, replaced by an absolute, lethal executive focus. She looked at Harrison Thorne not with anger, but with supreme, unadulterated contempt. "The board meeting is officially in session," Vivian announced, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings of the estate. Under Article 14 of the Meridian Corporate Charter, any board member caught engaging in active sabotage or the malicious destruction of corporate assets is subject to the immediate, non-negotiable termination of all voting rights pending an emergency shareholder restructuring. Harrison Thorne, you are stripped of your title, your seat, and your security clearance. Get out of my building and get out of my sight. Two of the heavy estate security guards stepped forward, their faces completely expressionless as they grabbed Harrison firmly by his elbows. The former billionaire didn't shout. He didn't fight. He looked utterly broken, his expensive leather shoes dragging slightly against the polished hardwood as he was marched out of the grand ballroom in front of the very peers he had spent decades trying to impress. The room fell into an intense, reverent silence as the massive double doors slammed shut behind Harrison. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The coup had been dismantled not by a boardroom negotiation, but by the quiet, undeniable brilliance of a single father who had been dismissed as common trash less than an hour ago. Preston Vance turned slowly toward Garrett, removing his glasses and looking at the younger man with a profound, unyielding respect that no amount of money could ever buy. "Commander Cross," Vance said softly, ensuring the entire room could hear every single syllable. 12 years ago, when the Aegis Defense Initiative was closed, the entire aerospace industry mourned the loss of its greatest tactical mind. We were told you had retired permanently, that you refused every corporate contract and every government bounty. May I ask why the legendary Ghost of the Ridge is currently operating a standard leased sedan for a civilian transport service? Garrett looked down at Lily, who was looking up at him from her plush armchair with wide, shining eyes. He reached down and gently smoothed the stray lock of hair behind her ear, his massive hand moving with an incredible, heartbreaking tenderness that completely captivated everyone watching. "Because 12 years ago, I was responsible for the safety of an entire nation's airspace, Mr. Vance," Garrett said, his voice entirely devoid of pride, carrying only the honest, grounded weight of a father's devotion. "But 7 years ago, I became responsible for her. Power, status, and legacy don't keep a child safe, sir. Peace does. I chose peace." Vivian stood just a few feet away, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Garrett, then at Lily, and felt the last remaining walls around her heart completely dissolve into nothingness. This man had commanded the highest corridors of military and technological power in the world, yet he chose a humble, quiet life in a small apartment just to ensure his daughter grew up with a father who was always there to catch her. He didn't need her money, he didn't need her status, he was entirely complete within his own quiet strength. Preston Vance nodded slowly, a deep, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. "A noble mission, Commander, but it seems the world still has a habit of needing your help." Vance turned his gaze to Vivian, his eyes twinkling with an absolute certainty. Miss Montgomery, regarding the acquisition of Triton Skyways. If this man is your lead logistical advisor, you have my absolute, unconditional financial backing. The entire $5 billion pool is yours. Let's sign the papers. The ink on the $5 billion Triton Skyways acquisition contract was barely dry, but for the first time in her hyper-focused career, Vivian Montgomery didn't care about the numbers on the page. The crowded ballroom was alive with the low, electric hum of stunned executives, venture capitalists, and journalists whispering about the total destruction of Harrison Thorne's legacy. Preston Vance handed the heavy fountain pen back to his assistant, his gaze drifting across the expanse of the room to where Garrett Cross stood by the tall arched windows, quietly watching the mountain fog begin to dissolve under the mid-morning sun. "You have a rare asset there, Vivian," Vance said softly, his voice carrying the weathered wisdom of a man who had seen empires rise and fall. "Men like Commander Cross don't sell their allegiance. They don't have a price. If he is standing by your side, it means he sees something in you that the rest of this ruthless world has forgotten how to value. Treasure that." Vivian offered a slow, genuine nod, her throat tightening slightly. "Thank you, Preston, for everything." Vance smiled, gave a respectful nod toward Garrett, and escorted the remaining board members out toward the private dining hall, leaving the terrace suite remarkably quiet. Vivian turned slowly, her heels clicking softly against the polished limestone floor as she approached the window. Garrett was kneeling by Lily's side, carefully packing away her colored pencils into a worn canvas pouch. Lily looked up as Vivian approached, her large, bright eyes completely devoid of the fear that had gripped her in the courtyard earlier. "Is the mean man gone?" Lily asked innocently, tilting her head. "He is gone, Lily," Vivian replied, her voice dropping its sharp corporate edge entirely, replacing it with a soft, trembling warmth that she didn't even recognize herself. "He will never bother your father or anyone else ever again." Lily smiled, a radiant, pure expression that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She reached into her sketchbook, carefully tearing along the perforated edge of the page she had been working on. She stepped forward and extended her small hands, offering the drawing to Vivian. "This is for you," Lily said softly, "so you don't have to look at the dark clouds anymore." Vivian froze. She looked down at the paper. It was a beautiful, meticulously detailed sketch of a pristine aircraft soaring high above a mountain range, its silver wings cutting effortlessly through a bright, sunlit sky. At the bottom, in neat, childish handwriting, Lily had written, "To the CEO lady." A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion hit Vivian squarely in the chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the drawing from the little girl. For 31 years, her life had been a series of transactions, trophies, metrics, revenue goals, and conditional praise. No one had ever given her something simply to bring her peace. No one had ever looked at her and noticed the dark clouds she carried. She slowly dropped to one knee, bringing herself to eye level with Lily, completely unbothered by the fact that her expensive designer suit was pressing against the dusty floor. "Thank you, Lily," Vivian whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she carefully folded the paper and held it against her heart. "This is the most valuable thing I have ever been given." Lily nodded happily, then turned and walked back to her father, wrapping her arms around his leg. Garrett placed his large protective hand on top of her head, his eyes meeting Vivian's as she slowly stood back up. The silence between them was profound, heavy with unspoken understanding. Vivian looked at the rugged lines of Garrett's face, the absolute steadiness in his gaze, and the quiet, undeniable masculinity that anchored him. She realized then that while she owned towering skyscrapers and controlled vast international fleets, she had absolutely nothing compared to the emotional security this man provided without even trying. She had everything, yet she had no peace. He had walking away from power, yet he was entirely invincible. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Cross," Vivian said, her voice soft, her guard completely lowered. "When you walked into my office this morning, I treated you with contempt. I judged you because you chose to be a father instead of a corporate machine. I thought money bought safety. I was wrong." Garrett stood up straight, his frame imposing yet entirely comforting. "You didn't know, Miss Montgomery. In your world, vulnerability is a weakness that people use to destroy you. You've been trained to keep your shields up. I don't fault a soldier for wearing armor in a war zone." Vivian took a half step closer, the subtle scent of pine and worn leather radiating from him. The physical proximity sent a quiet, electric charge through her veins. "Why did you take the dispatch call this morning, Garrett? Preston Vance said you refused every high-paying contract in the country. You could be running a global defense sector, yet you showed up at dawn to drive a temporary sedan for a panicked executive. It couldn't have been a random coincidence." Garrett's expression didn't change, but a shadow of something deeply personal and agonizingly heavy passed through his dark eyes. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a small, faded digital storage drive, holding it between his fingers. "It wasn't a coincidence, Vivian," Garrett said, using her first name for the very first time, his deep voice carrying a chilling resonance that made her breath catch. 3 years ago, my late wife's vehicle suffered an identical firmware corruption on the Oak Haven Ridge Pass. The local police ruled it an accidental system failure. But when your primary transport suffered the exact same tactical blackout this morning, my old military monitors picked up the specific digital signature of the encryption key used to override your garage security. Vivian's eyes widened in absolute shock, the blood draining from her face as she stared at the small drive in his hand. "What are you saying?" Garrett stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly, dangerous whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "Harrison Thorne didn't invent that cyber weapon, Vivian. He didn't have the technical capability. He was buying those transceivers from an elite, black market syndicate that has been systematically sabotaging Meridian Aerospace's prototypes for a decade. The same syndicate my father was tracking before he passed. Harrison was just a pawn. The real mastermind behind the destruction of your family's legacy and the death of my wife is currently sitting inside the secondary control room at your own headquarters." The ride back down the mountain pass was executed in a terrifyingly tense silence, but the internal geometry of the Valiant Sentinel had completely transformed. Vivian Montgomery no longer sat in the isolated luxury of the rear cabin. She sat in the front passenger seat, her eyes occasionally drifting to Garrett Cross as his powerful hands guided the heavy steering wheel through the dissipating fog. In the back seat, Lily was fast asleep, her small head resting against her backpack, cradled by the smooth, predictable motion of the vehicle. They did not go to the main lobby of the Meridian Aerospace Tower. Garrett bypassed the public entrance entirely, maneuvering the sedan down a restricted service ramp that led to the subterranean baseline server vaults. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs as she swiped her master executive keycard against the unpolished steel security door. Niles Whitaker, the brilliant, reclusive senior systems director who had managed the company's digital architecture for 15 years, was standing in the center of the secondary control room. The space was cast in a deep sapphire glow, illuminated by dozens of monitors tracking real-time satellite telemetry. Niles was frantically entering strings of deletion code into a terminal, his face pale under the fluorescent glare. He didn't hear the door slide open. He only realized he was no longer alone when Garrett's deep, booming voice shattered the quiet hum of the cooling fans. "The encryption wipe won't clear the localized backup registries, Niles," Garrett said, his level tone vibrating with a deadly, quiet certainty that froze the director's fingers over the keyboard. "I mirrored the core database the exact second you deployed the firmware override to Harrison's transceiver. The digital trail is complete." Niles spun around, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. He looked at Vivian, then down at the tarnished silver coin Garrett was now placing flat on the console between them. The moment Niles saw the engraved celestial hawk, the air completely left his lungs. "You," Niles whispered, his voice trembling as he stumbled backward against the server rack. "Harrison said you were just a contract driver from the Valley Pool. He said the ghost of the ridge died in the mountains 12 years ago." "The mountain didn't claim me, Niles," Garrett replied, stepping forward, his massive frame completely cutting off the director's only exit route. "But your greed claimed my wife. 3 years ago, you sold the prototype navigational ciphers to an outside corporate syndicate. When Elena noticed the anomaly in the transit logs, you didn't just delete the data. You deployed a terminal brake override on her vehicle while she was driving through the high ridge. You thought it was a perfect, untraceable accident." Niles looked desperately at the terminal, his hand twitching toward an emergency purge button. "I had no choice," the director shouted, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. "Harrison was going to liquidate the subsectors anyway. The syndicate offered me more money than this entire company earns in a fiscal quarter. I just wrote the software, Cross. I didn't know she would be on the road that morning." "You knew exactly what that software would do," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the room with a chilling, absolute authority. She stepped into the light, her eyes blazing with a fierce, redemptive fury that left Niles completely paralyzed. "You destroyed my family's legacy. You compromised our national security, and you took a mother away from a little girl just to balance an offshore bank account." Before Niles could utter another lie, the heavy reinforced doors of the control vault burst open. 2 federal marshals, accompanied by Audrey Sterling and a contingent of armed airfield security officers, flooded the room. Within seconds, Niles Whitaker was stripped of his badges, slammed against the metal server casing, and tightly handcuffed. As the authorities marched the broken mastermind away, the secondary control room fell into an intensely peaceful, radiant silence. The digital screens flickered back to their baseline status, displaying the flawless, stable flight path of the Calum 9 aerocruiser high above the valley. The war was finally over. Justice had been delivered not by a multi-billion-dollar military operation, but by the quiet, unyielding love of a single father who had refused to let the darkness win. 2 weeks later, the morning sun broke magnificently over Blackwood Airfield, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished composite hangar doors of Meridian Aerospace. Inside the newly renovated executive suite on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere was entirely different. The cold, sterile marble ornaments had been replaced by warm oak accents. On the corner of Vivian's massive mahogany desk, positioned in a beautiful hand-carved silver frame, sat Lily's colorful drawing of the silver-winged aircraft, soaring above the dark clouds. The heavy double doors opened smoothly, and Garrett walked in, carrying Lily on his shoulders. He wore a clean, dark navy button-down shirt, his rugged features completely relaxed. Lily laughed happily as Garrett gently set her down on the plush leather couch, where she immediately opened a brand-new, leather-bound sketchbook that Vivian had personally delivered to their apartment the previous evening. Vivian turned away from the glass window, a genuine, soft smile completely transforming her face. She looked vibrant, peaceful, and entirely grounded. "The board approved the foundational restructuring this morning," Vivian said softly, stepping toward Garrett, her eyes locking onto his with an intense, unmistakable warmth. The new autonomous safety architecture has been officially designated as the Cross-Defense Protocol. Every civilian and military aircraft we build from this day forward will carry your father's original engineering guidelines, and your wife's name has been permanently inscribed on our National Aviation Memorial hangar. Garrett looked at her, a profound, unyielding respect softening the sharp lines of his jaw. "Thank you, Vivian. It's more than my family ever asked for." Vivian took a slow, deliberate step closer, her hand gently resting against the fabric of his sleeve. The quiet electric chemistry that had been building between them since that frantic morning in the fog was no longer an unspoken tension. It was a solid, beautifully constructed reality. "Preston Vance called me yesterday," Vivian whispered, her voice dropping to a beautifully tender register. "He asked if the legendary Commander Cross would consider taking over the global operations sector. He offered an incredible salary, a corner suite, and a permanent seat at the main table." Garrett offered a small, incredibly handsome smile, his deep baritone sending a comforting vibration through the quiet room. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that you were entirely overqualified for the boardroom," Vivian said, her eyes shining with absolute sincerity, "and that I had already hired you for a far more critical permanent position." Garrett raised an eyebrow, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fleeting, beautiful second before returning to her eyes. "Is that so? And what position is that, Miss Montgomery?" "Navigation," Vivian said softly, a breathless, hopeful smile breaking across her face as she looked at the man who had given her safety, without ever asking for a single dollar in return. "I've spent my entire life flying through storms alone, Garrett. I don't want to fly alone anymore. I need someone who knows how to find the peace through the clouds." Garrett didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, his large, warm hand gently cupping the side of her face, his thumb smoothing over her cheekbone with a protective, masculine tenderness that made the entire corporate empire outside the window completely fade into insignificance. "That, Vivian," Garrett whispered softly, his eyes promising a future full of absolute, unwavering safety, "I can definitely help with." From the couch, Lily looked up from her sketchbook, watching her father and the CEO lady with a wide, knowing smile. She picked up her silver pencil and began to draw 3 figures standing together on a sunlit runway, entirely free of the dark clouds, ready to take flight into a beautiful, unwritten tomorrow.